C.S. Lewis was born in Belfast, Ireland in 1898 and was named Clive by his parents, with the middle name of Staples after his great-great-grandmother, and was called Jack by his friends. But today, he's better known as C.S. Lewis, one of the intellectual giants of the 20th century, and one of the most influential writers of his time. He wrote more than 30 books, with thousands of people discovering his writing for the first time every year. To date, his Narnia books alone have sold over 100 million copies and been made into 3 major movies. His works include science fiction, fantasy, theology, philosophy, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. Before we learn about C.S. Lewis, the author, let's learn a little bit about him as a person. He was born into a home full of books, humor, intelligence, and faith. His mother was a minister's daughter with a talent for writing and mathematics. His father was a solicitor, which is a kind of lawyer, and they raised Clive and his brother Warren to be critical thinkers and to embrace happiness to the highest degree. But his interest in fantasy literature was entirely his own. His and Warren's, that is. The brothers were voracious readers, especially of the popular Beatrix Potter stories, and would in turn write stories and create whole worlds for themselves. Lands populated by dressed-up animals that could talk and wear clothes, and that had whole economic and political systems, buildings, and historical context. Much later, these stories were gathered up and published in this book, Boxen, The Imaginary World of Young C.S. Lewis. But a shadow came over young Jack at the age of 9 when, in spite of his passionate prayers, his mother lost her fight against cancer, a loss that deeply affected both brothers and their father, who were left on their own to navigate life without her steadying influence. With my mother's death, Lewis later wrote, all that was tranquil and reliable disappeared from my life. Within a few years, young Lewis had rejected the faith of his parents and declared himself an atheist, or a person who doesn't believe that God exists at all. But he carried on, and with his love of learning and remarkable mind, Lewis graduated from high school and then received a scholarship to Oxford University in 1916. An academic career that was interrupted by World War I, or the Great War as it was called then. His 19th birthday was his first day in the trenches in France. He had a friend he served with during the war named Patty, and the two of them made a pact that if one of them was killed in battle, the other would take care of his friend's elder single parent. Well, as it turns out, Patty was killed, and Lewis did follow through on his promise. After being wounded in battle and sent home, he looked after Patty's mother and sister for many years. At one point, they all lived together here, and Lewis's brother Warren joined them in a house called the Kilns. Well, after the war, Lewis returned to Oxford and was eventually offered the position of fellow and tutor in English literature at Oxford University and stayed until 1954, when he was unanimously elected to the chair of medieval and Renaissance literature at Cambridge University, a position he held until his retirement. It was while he was at Oxford that Lewis met a fellow professor named J.R.R. Tolkien, whom you may know as the author of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. And the two became close friends. They both served on the English faculty at Oxford together, and they were both active in the informal literary group known as the Inklings. The Inklings used to spend hours at this pub, sharing their writing and ideas with each other and discussing philosophy, theology, literature, and life. It was largely due to the influence of Tolkien that Lewis later returned to his faith. And this is important because his faith profoundly affected his work, and his wartime radio broadcasts on the subject of Christianity brought him wide acclaim. It was during this time, between 1950 and 1956, that he wrote his famous series about the adventures of children in the world of Narnia, guided by the wise and powerful lion Aslan, the true king of Narnia. One of the many books he also wrote later in life was called Surprised by Joy, and it was a sort of autobiographical look at his childhood and discovery and then lifelong pursuit of the phenomenon he labeled joy, an intense feeling for something so good and high up that it could not be described in words. He said he first experienced it when his brother showed him a wonderful little green and seemingly magical garden he'd made in a box. And this tiny, glorious little green and private world gave him such a pang of delight and longing that he just never forgot it. And later he identified this feeling of joy and talked about it as a sort of signpost toward life's true meaning. Now, the funny thing about Surprised by Joy is that the American poet and writer Joy Davidman, who edited this book's final copy, would eventually become C.S. Lewis's wife. They fell in love after 2 years of correspondence following the publication of the book. So while Lewis didn't write the book Surprised by Joy about his wife at all, his friends were quick to notice this fun coincidence and liked to talk about how Lewis really had been surprised by joy. Sadly, however, the newlyweds would not have long to enjoy life together. Joy was diagnosed with cancer and died only 4 years after their wedding. Lewis continued to write, processing his loss as he had all the others along the way through a lens of faith and grief and hope and, yes, eventually, joy. He wrote a book about this process called A Grief Observed under a pseudonym. Not knowing that he was the author, several of his friends recommended the book to him as a way to help him work through the sadness of his loss. And then 3 years later, on November 22nd, 1963, exactly 1 week before his 65th birthday, Lewis collapsed in his bedroom at 5:30 p.m. and died a few minutes later. News of his death was almost completely overshadowed by media coverage of the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, who was killed less than an hour earlier. But the loss of C.S. Lewis was felt keenly then, and it still is today. Readers and thinkers from around the world agree that when he died, the world lost one of its most cherished and prolific authors. And we are so grateful for the imagination he shared with us throughout his life and for the way he brought us along on his journey through life and faith and joy. Thank you, C.S. Lewis, for inviting us into the wardrobe, into Narnia, and into so many lands and worlds beyond.